Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation today. I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing recently, and it's a pleasure to be involved in this lecture series. So my name's Colin McFarlane. I'm a geographer at Durham University in Northeast England. I'm going to try and share my screen now and hope that it works okay. So let's see, we can just do this. 1 second. Okay, so I hope you can see those slides okay, and that you can see the title slides, and I'll just get started. And please let me know if there's any technical problems with the slides, or if there's any problem at all with any of this, just let me know. Okay, so the title today is Fragments of the City, Making and Remaking Urban Worlds. And the reason I've chosen this particular title is because this is very much what I've been working on for the past couple of years, alongside some other research themes. And I've just published a book with this title in the last few weeks, which, you know, it's been on my mind, obviously, because the book has been coming to an end. So I want to talk really about that book and what I've tried to do in that book as a way of trying to make sense of cities and the urban condition today. So the outline of what I want to talk about then is on the slide there. I'm interested in this idea of fragments. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that. But really, in broad terms, I think about fragments as those often discarded, marginalized, neglected bits and pieces of the city, those elements of the city that might be easily overlooked, which take on different roles at different times in urban life. And I want to talk about fragments in three different ways, using different examples which I draw on in the book. And obviously, I'm just going to give very selective examples here today, just to hopefully provoke some reflection and discussion. And my overall argument really is that fragments matter for how we understand cities. Those little things, those small elements that make up so much of the urban realm around us, so much of the stuff of cities is just fragments of stuff that goes on. Sometimes it's very fleeting and it's there and it's gone. Sometimes they're more obdurate and endurant, but they're around us all the time, these little fragments of things. And they're part of the urban commons, and they're part of our everyday life. So I want to talk about why I think they matter through three different forms of the fragment. The first is material fragments. So this is literally the bits and pieces of stuff that we see around us in the city, broken bits of pieces, discarded objects, ruins, all kinds of things. And I want to draw on a particular example from Cape Town, which I've worked on with some colleagues here in the UK. And then secondly, I want to talk about a very different kind of fragment, the idea of a knowledge fragment. So this is forms of knowledge or ways of knowing the city, which are often pushed to the urban margins, which are often excluded, which often have less power and less prevalence and less presence in the city, right? And I'm interested in how those knowledge fragments expand the possibilities for understanding cities today. And there I want to draw on a very quick example from Kampala in Uganda, again, based on collaborative research with colleagues based here and in Kampala. And then finally, I want to talk about a different kind of fragment again, the idea of writing in fragments. So this is about textual fragments, fragments as bits of text that are part of urban writing. And there's a long history of urbanists trying to write about cities using the fragment form, right? And I'm interested really in how that form of fragment writing relates to the content, right? So in other words, the way we talk about cities matters for how we talk about cities. And here the fragment is quite an interesting idea. So I'll explain what I mean by that when I get to that point of the presentation. So those are the three ways of thinking about fragments. They're all quite different, but my argument in the book is that these together offer us a way of thinking about cities today. They come together as different entry points into the nature of cities and the urban condition. So we can really push and experiment with this idea of the fragment as a form of material, as a form of knowledge, as a form of expression, in order to build a larger understanding of the cities around us in an increasingly urbanizing world. So that's kind of the starting point of the book, right? To experiment with this idea of the fragment and its different materializations and instantiations in the city. Now, I'm not going to talk a great deal about the idea of the commons. I know that the commons is important for the lectures series that you've been exploring, and this is one of the themes that came up in the discussion as I was thinking about today's lecture. But I hope that what I've got to say, and I'll come back to this in conclusion, has implications for how we understand the commons. And really what I want to try to say to you is that fragments, these three different kinds of fragments, are caught up with how we understand the commons, the urban commons, right? They're part of, they're entry points for how we understand how to cope with an urban commons which is often exclusive and exclusionary. They are part of challenging the nature of those the unequal urban commons that we see in cities, increasingly so today. But they're also fragments are also part of a project, a political project, of reimagining the urban commons, of imagining the urban commons as a different kind of entity, right? So I think about the urban commons as a problem of distribution, right? How do we distribute resources, provisions, infrastructures, opportunities across the city? And fragments are both expressions of the inequality of distribution in the urban commons, but they're also means through which people reinvent or challenge those inequalities, right? They become routes to challenging those inequalities. So I'll come back to that in the conclusion very briefly. Now, fragments, I partly got interested in the idea of fragments from just walking around cities. And I won't talk a lot about walking, but I think when we think about cities, a lot of our understanding comes from walking around or moving around in one way or the other, right? On foot or otherwise in cities. And I think urbanists often underestimate how important moving around is in a city. And a lot of what I see in the book, of course, it comes from research projects, interviews, ethnographies, and so on. And I'll talk about some of that work. But it was often just through walking around. And this is my home city, Newcastle, which is nearby where I'm talking to you from right now. And this is an old walkway that was built in the 1970s, but was never completed. You can't quite tell from the image, actually, but it was never completed. And there's various parts of the city where these walkways were never completed. And these walkways were partly what got me thinking about the idea of fragments, right? These incomplete things that kind of hang around in the city. And sometimes their purpose is obvious and sometimes it isn't, right? And there's a litany, a vast archive of these kinds of fragments all over our cities. So this was one of the reasons I got interested in fragments, but I also got interested in fragments through particular research projects in places like India, South Africa, Uganda, and elsewhere. And I'll talk about some of those projects where I was interested in how people were working with these material fragments in the city. Now, when we talk about fragments, it's important to begin by acknowledging the increasingly important process of fragmentation, right? The process of fragmentation through which cities are increasingly divided and made more and more unequal. And we know this story, don't we, of cities becoming fragmented materially. So, we can think about images like this from Mumbai, the top image, where you see that spatial materialization of fragmentation, right? You've got very poor neighborhoods in the foreground, and then in the background, these kind of increasingly expensive apartment blocks for the middle and upper classes, which tend to siphon off infrastructure, like water, like electricity, and so on. So this kind of fragmentation of the material spatiality of the city, a process that Steve Graham and Simon Marvin, of course, called Splintering Urbanism, a very important book published 20 years ago, almost exactly to the day, that helped us understand these processes. But it's also fragmented socially. and it's also fragmented in different kinds of ways. Cities are increasingly fragmented in all kinds of realms, politically, economically, socially, spatially, materially. And we know that story, and we know what the drivers are of that. We know what's causing it, and we know that those drivers change from place to place. Just to pick out some of them, and I'm sure you will think of many others. But we can think about land prices and land costs, the costs of land, the costs of housing, which increasingly pushes people out, lower and middle class people out of city centres and expensive neighbourhoods into more and more peripheral, insecure, often rented homes. We can think about the disinvestment in infrastructure and services. This comes back to the commons, the idea of the urban commons. Not investing in the basics, whether it's housing or infrastructure, for all those who live in the city. And we can think about the role of the state, whether the state has the money or has the political will to genuinely challenge these processes of fragmentation. So there's all kinds of drivers that we can, those are just three, but there's others that we can talk about which drive fragmentation. And we see it in cities all over the world, cities that I've done research in myself. You see increasingly these very unequal land and housing conditions in places like Hong Kong and Mumbai, where you get this kind of sharp juxtaposition of fragmentation around housing and infrastructure, and quite often the violent displacement of lower income communities. As Ricky Burdett at London School of Economics has described it, cities are becoming increasingly unequal, but that inequality is increasingly spatialized, as I've been saying. We see that inequality in the fragmentation of urban space and the production of social extremes. So in other words, a greater concentration of wealth in some parts of the city and a greater concentration of poverty in the other, and that inequality increasingly growing, especially in large cities, right? So, we see vast inequalities, especially in the bigger cities of the urban world. Housing and land, as I've been saying, is really generating a lot of that. Global real estate values before the COVID-19 pandemic were huge. They're making a very strong comeback, of course. The pandemic hasn't stopped that. And a number of books in recent years have described this process of producing land and housing in commercial zones in the city, which are increasingly unequal and exclusive and expensive. So fragmentation then is a kind of urban development strategy, right? It's not an accident. It happens because of people speculating and investing in urban real estate all over the world. And we see it in different kinds of urban forms, especially, of course, the dense tower block construction, which leads to all kinds of exclusion and land and housing politics in different parts of the urban world. I won't go into detail on that. I'm sure you know that from your own cities as well as I do. Places like, so you then get a geography like this. This is Rafiq Nagar in Mumbai, northeast Mumbai, where I've done some research. Now, what's important here is to recognize that the process of fragmentation produces fragments, right? It produces material fragments of stuff. So here in this image, we can see some of the fragments of stuff that people living on the margins of the city, people living in poor neighborhoods, what is often called slums in Mumbai, are having to contend with every day just to make basic provisions work, right? So fragments that put together makeshift toilets that are used to collect water, that are used as improvisatory drains, that are used to build housing, sackcloth, wood, corrugated metal and iron, that are used to supplement, fix and repair water pipes, which spaghetti their way around lower income neighborhoods and so on. A whole geography and world of different kinds of fragments thrown together as a very precarious, vulnerable infrastructure and set of services which people depend on as basic urban life support, right? Just to exist. And which people have to work on, especially women, in terms of doing some of the labor of everyday work on these fragments. Okay, so this is very important, these fragments. So I'm interested in the book. I'm interested in this question of the fragment. How is life lived in the fragment city? What are its conditions? How are they being contested? What forms of knowledge, practice, and possibility emerge when we examine the fragments of the city, right? So that's my entry point in the book. That's the book there. Looking at these bits and pieces of the city and how they are caught up in urban experience and politics. And as you probably guessed, I'm interested in fragments not just as things that are there in the city, not just as nouns, but as verbs. In other words, as things that do stuff in the city, right? As forms of action and practice in the city. So what I mean by that is that fragments, material fragments, are made meaningful in people's lives because of how people use them, right? So it's not so much the fragments themselves, but the relationships that the fragments become caught up in, right? The relationships the fragments become enrolled in. So different people from different walks of life use fragments in different kinds of ways. And I'll give some quick examples of that. And it's that enrolling of fragments in different uses which gives us the insight into urban experience and politics that I think is important for material fragments. And sometimes the ways in which people use fragments can be surprising. Sometimes it can be very routine and predictable. And I'm going to talk about three types of fragments: material fragments, knowledge fragments, and writing fragments. So material fragments, I want to give an example of this idea of using fragments in different kinds of ways, right? And here I want to turn to the city of Cape Town, where I've done some research, and give a very quick example of that. What I'm interested in this example is how a fragment gets reinvented, remade with a different kinds of political objective in mind, right? So here's an example from sanitation in Cape Town. I've done a lot of research on sanitation and the kind of politics of access to basic provisions like water and toilets and so on. And in Cape Town, I did some work with Jonathan Silver, a colleague at Sheffield University, where we were looking at how fragments of infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure, were being politicized in the city. So here you can see an open-air toilet in one image from 2009. So the city council produced these toilets, but said it didn't have the budget to cover them with walls and ceilings and floors and so on. And then below it, you can see some of the standalone toilets that are used in informal settlements and townships in different parts of Cape Town. So there's a long history of sanitation politics in Cape Town. I won't have time to go into it, but just to say this particular story quickly. So what happened was, way back 10 years ago, there were toilet cleaners, people paid by the municipality, a private company, to clean toilets in informal settlements and townships. And what they did was they would go to toilets and basically empty the buckets that are in these toilets. So these are outside toilets, and they have kind of buckets inside them, which get emptied out once a week by this private company paid by the municipality. The company went on strike because of a disagreement about salary, and as a result, these buckets weren't being collected and they weren't being cleaned. So they just kind of obviously overflowed, and it caused pollution and health concerns in different parts of Cape Town. And this led to an activist movement protesting the provision of these substandard sanitation fragments, right? So these aren't really functioning sanitation infrastructures. These are fragments because they're totally inadequate to meet the needs of people's everyday lives. They're often broken, they're often insufficient, they often can't be relied upon, right? So these fragments got worse and worse over time, and this led to an activist movement called Says Kona, which means we are here, a group of activists and residents that were trying to protest these fragments. So what they did was they took these buckets, these fragments of infrastructure, and they decided to empty these buckets in different parts of the city as a protest against urban inequalities. So they targeted different parts of the city. This is the N2 motorway where they emptied these buckets to stop the traffic, one of the city's main roads. It led to a whole bunch of arrests and violence. And in the media, they became called poo protesters. And then there was all kinds of other examples. This is them in the airports in Cape Town protesting against the provision of inadequate fragments of sanitation by emptying these buckets in the airport. This is the image at the bottom, is activists emptying the buckets in the state legislature in Cape Town, so the political establishment. So really targeting key sites in Cape Town, roads, airports, political sites in the city. So a really kind of a powerful sort of geographical political strategy of taking these fragments of infrastructure, which normally sit in a toilet, an outside toilet in a poor neighborhood, and bringing them to somewhere where they would never really have any business being, as a form of protest, right? Emptying them out in the street. And you can see some quotes there from Ciscona activists talking about why they were targeting places like the airport, why they were targeting places like the state legislature. It was a way of kind of bringing the problem of waste and inadequate fragments of sanitation right to the front of the city, to the political and the economic heartlands of the city, and to generate debate at local and national level about sanitation, dignity, and civil rights. So this is a way then of taking fragments and reinventing them as a political strategy in the city. So this is just one example of many examples that I explore in the book of trying to reinvent fragments of infrastructure, material fragments for political purposes. And also, at the same time, challenging the maldistribution, the unequal distribution that underpins the urban commons in Cape Town. And this is caught up, of course, with the history of race and class and apartheid in that city. Also led to a new politicization of fragments, where people were saying we're not satisfied with these fragments. We want proper toilets, with functioning flushing systems that we can rely upon in our homes, rather than these outside, outdated kind of bucket toilet systems. Okay, so that's material fragments. Now, very quickly, I want to turn to knowledge fragments and give a quick example of what I mean by knowledge fragments and how I explore that in the book. And here I want to take a different example, also from Africa, but this time moving north to Uganda and to the capital city, Kampala. And again, this is work I've done with colleagues, Joel Ongwick in Kampala, Jonathan Silver in Sheffield, and others, where we tried to make sense of fragments of knowledge. So this is not about fragments of material things. This is about fragments of knowledge. And so these knowledge fragments I define as forms of knowledge marginalized by dominant cultures, actors, groups, and power relations in the city. So these are stories that go on in the city. They're ways of knowing the city. They're bits of knowledge that people have about the city, but they're often excluded from, for example, the mainstream cultural, political, and economic debates of that city and its future, right? So we were interested in Kampala. How do we take these fragments of knowledge, which often don't register in the mainstream debates, and try to bring them more into those political debates about the nature of the city and its future, right? So the way in which we decided to do this, working with residents in a neighborhood called Namawongo, which is an informal settlement, a very poor neighborhood in the center of Kampala, was to try to organize an exhibition about people's everyday lives. In other words, to put the knowledge and experience of people's lives on show in the city's major museum, the Uganda Museum, and to try to challenge this idea that there are forms of knowledge which are excluded from mainstream planning and policy and debates in the city, and bring those fragments into the center of the city. So what we did then was we worked with some residents to produce an exhibition called Celebrating Namawongo. This was a very simple exhibition. The aim of it, working with the residents, was to say, how do people understand their lives? What kinds of knowledge do they use day to day to cope with their struggles, to cope with inadequate housing, inadequate infrastructure, all the stuff I've been talking about in Cape Town? And how do they imagine the urban future? What kinds of dreams and aspirations and ideas do they have for the future of Namawongo, but also for the future of Kampala, right? So really to bring and challenge the knowledge politics of the city. And so we worked with a small group of residents of different age groups and genders and economic positions in the neighbourhood to try to tell their story of how they encounter Namawongo as a neighbourhood, but also how they move around Kampala, their daily lives, how they work, where they buy food, who they hang out with, what kinds of families and struggles and issues that they have. And we tried to ask them to map their own knowledge of the city, right? So where do they go to? What kind of places? What kind of encounters? What's their knowledge maps? And we produced these maps and brought them together and then formed them into an exhibition at the Uganda Museum, which you can see there in the image. And we held meetings with local NGOs, non-governmental organizations. We also organised discussions with policymakers. And the whole idea was that there are fragments of marginalised knowledge which are out there in the city but excluded from mainstream debate, and to bring them into these settings. So that led to a whole series of events, including events around discussing the priorities that people who were working with Namawongo had for the future of Namawongo and Kampala. So issues like sanitation again, but also housing, education, youth employment, widows. There's a lot of widows, unfortunately, sadly, in the area because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the local state, HIV/AIDS itself, other health provisions, right? The kinds of knowledge concerns that people had in their own lives, right? And some of the reactions that we got from people at the exhibition really revealed the ways in which knowledge fragments can change how people might see the nature of the urban condition and its future. So this is one NGO representative speaking about it at one of the meetings in Kampala, having seen the exhibition. And he says, there's so much going on in Namawongo. I normally think about housing, land and water, but there's also all this energy. And he talks about how Namawongo is alive, how there's lots of enthusiasm, how people are interconnected with one another, and how he should help through his organisation to nurture and grow the ideas and knowledge and life of the neighbourhood, right? So in other words, he was starting to see how these fragments of discarded knowledge about life and the future from neighbourhoods like Namawongo might start to open up new ways of seeing the city, might open up new ways of seeing urban possibilities, and might change how he works with people in those neighbourhoods. So these are knowledge fragments that we brought into an exhibition and a set of events as a way of challenging some of the political debate in Kampala about the city and its futures. So very different from the material fragments in Cape Town. I'm talking here about a very different kind of fragment, but I think it's quite useful to hold on to these different instantiations of fragments, material and knowledge fragments, as a way of really trying to understand the nature of urban fragmentation today and the possibilities for addressing it. Thirdly, and finally, I want just quickly to talk about the third example of fragments that I use in the book, and that's the idea of writing in fragments. Okay, so this is different again, right? This is stretching the notion of fragment even further. So this is to think about the long history of writing about cities and the urban condition that uses the fragment form of text. So actually experiments with little chunks of text of different lengths for different purposes. And some examples of that there on the screen. One example that I just want to spotlight because it's about Sao Paulo, and some of you may have read this book. There's a book from Luis Rufato from, I think it was originally published in 2001, so about 20 years old or about that, called There Were Many Horses. And if you haven't read this book about Sao Paulo, you probably have. I hadn't read it until about a year ago, and I thought it was a really wonderful insight into the city. I've only been to Sao Paulo a few times, but a really fascinating story about the nature of life in the city. And he writes this book in fragments. So it's written as a set of fragments of text, 68 fragments in particular, usually about 2 or 3 pages long. And I think this is such an exciting and enabling way to write about cities, right? Because we tend to write about cities in very particular ways, long essays, long chapters, but the fragment form opens up different ways of thinking about this that I was very intrigued with, and that's why I wrote my own book in a fragment form. But Rufato, his book is structured around one day. So it follows one day in Sao Paulo from sunrise to sunset. And he tells the story of Sao Paulo from different people's perspectives. So we hear about lots of different people and their experience of this one day, right? And it goes, the only structure to it is chronological, from sunset to sunrise to sunset. Otherwise, it moves across all kinds of themes, all kinds of people from different walks of life in the city. And so each fragment is designed to give the reader a particular glimpse into the multiplicity of life in Sao Paulo, right? So we just get one glimpse of one person's encounter with the city, and then we're somewhere else, and then we're somewhere else again, move from place to place in a very fleeting way, almost in a kind of cinematic way. And he draws on all kinds of sources. So we've got extracts from menus in restaurants, prayers, horoscopes, answer phone messages. He lists books in people's shelves to tell you something about the kind of person they are. You hear stories about people's life struggles at work, their fears, their aspirations. You hear stories of crime, faith, kindness, friendship, families helping each other out or sometimes not helping each other out. And we get all these glimpses happening all around us all the time in the city every day. And his whole point seems to be this is all going on at the same time. And how do we make sense of those fragments? So what emerges then is a city of fleeting moments and encounters. Sao Paulo as a kind of city in motion, right? So because we're moving from case to case, from case to case, because we never settle anywhere for any length of time, we get this idea of Sao Paulo as always on the move, right? Of people encountering one another, of people encountering different places, of being reminded of different memories, of all of that rushing past one another and sometimes clashing against one another in different kinds of moments that are often unpredictable. And people attempting to make sense of what is a multifaceted city, which is always exceeding their grasp, right? Trying to figure this city out, but it's always just over the hill. It's always beyond grasp, you know? Even amongst all the routines and predictabilities, there are always these excesses and complexities and surprises going on. And people try to read this and make sense of it, try to make sense of who to avoid, who to spend time with, who to trust, who to connect with, who to move past, and so on. So his form of fragment writing is to try to give a sense of the nature of the city through the form itself, right? And he does this including his use of punctuation and font. He has big fonts and small fonts, pauses, emphases, shifts in his writing, changes of speed in his writing, to give a sense of the city as changing, this kind of unpredictable, cacophonous, noisy city. I've got a little extract there to give you a sense of the kind of thing he experiments with, often quite poetically in the city. So the fragment form then enables here a sense of the movement and multiplicity of urban experience. Okay, so in the book that I've just published, Fragments of the City, I try to use the fragment form in a different kind of way from Ruffato. I have slightly longer fragments of text rather than the really short fragments. I sort of linger a little bit longer in particular places than he does for different reasons. But I think what I kind of share with people, or what I find inspiring rather, from people like Ruffato and others who've used the fragment form as a way of telling a story about the city, is three things. One is that the writing in fragments enables a loose form of juxtaposition. So it allows us to connect things which kind of don't belong together, right? So think back to the Cape Town protesters and the way in which they use those buckets, those fragments of infrastructure, and bring them to parts of the city where they wouldn't normally belong. You know, the state government, the airport. In a way, fragment writing mirrors that. It does something like that. It allows us to move very quickly between different kinds of sites, issues, places in the city, in sort of surprising ways, right? And to try to find the connections between them. So the fragment form is about connecting disharmonious, things that don't quite fit. It allows us to do that. And I think Ruffato does that beautifully in his book. And what it says, by bringing those cases together, is it reinforces a larger argument about the nature of the city, whether it's Sao Paulo or Mumbai or Cape Town or Kampala, but also about the nature of the larger urban world, like the urban condition that we live in. So in other words, it's experimenting all the time. It's experimenting with combinatory possibilities. It's experimenting with what to combine and how to combine it. And it does, sometimes those combinations sort of reinforce and resonate and get louder and amplify one another, right? They amplify one another. And other times, those combinations contradict one another. So you can actually disrupt the flow and introduce a surprise to the text. The second reason I think writing in fragments is exciting and enabling and different from a lot of the writing we do on cities is that it facilitates a kind of movement between different forms of inquiry, right? So because it's about creating glimpses and fleeting images of places and ideas and moments, because it doesn't linger in any particular place for any real length of time, which of course is one of the reasons you might want to criticize it, because it's always moving on to the next thing. But because it does that, it allows understanding to emerge in the connections, in the in-between. So in other words, it holds on to these intersecting lines of inquiry in tension altogether, right? It keeps them alive, these intersecting differences. Now you can do that with other forms of writing, but the fragment form of writing is particularly helpful at keeping these different lines of inquiry juggling, all these plates spinning at once. This is what Rufato does in Sao Paulo, I think. All the plates keep spinning at the same time, and it's the connection between the plates. That's where we see the understanding of the city, of the urban condition emerging, right? And what's really powerful about that is that we also see that there's no single story of the city which can grasp the complexity of a city like Sao Paulo or Mumbai or many other cities, right? We need, in a sense, to move between these differences to see the multiplicity and to try to make sense of the multiplicity, not to try to bypass it into a singular framework. That's something that the fragment form of writing helps us do as well. Of course, there's different ways of doing it, fragment writing, but that's one of the things that I found very exciting about it. And then the last thing to say is that I think fragment writing allows us to use form, the form of writing, right? So textual fragments, to reinforce the content, the story that we want to tell about the city. So there's a long, long history of this. I mentioned Walter Benjamin in one of the previous slides. I think he's a very powerful example of that in his writing about Paris or Berlin, for example. Trying to understand the damaged nature of urban modernity, the fragmentations that we see all around us that I started the talk with, and to try to write in a way which mirrors that fragmentation. So the fragmentation of the text mirrors the fragmentation of the city, of the urban form. And that, of course, it's not like that's a necessary thing. It's not like you have to write in fragments to tell a story about the fragmentation of the city. You can write in all kinds of ways about the fragmentation of the city. But the form of writing in fragments can reinforce, can give power to that story of fragmentation by mirroring the content in the actual form itself. So just to wrap this up then, in conclusion, I'm aware I've moved across 3 very different kinds of fragments and done so quite quickly, so the talk might well feel slightly fragmented, but the point of that was to try to give you a sense of how in the book I'm trying to make sense of what the fragment can do for how we understand cities and the urban condition more broadly. And I'm trying to do that by experimenting with the fragment in different ways. So I could have just stuck with the fragment as a material form, and that would have made sense, or I could have just stuck with it as a knowledge form. But in a sense, what I find exciting about the fragment as an entry point to understanding cities is precisely the kind of moving between different expressions of the fragment: form of materiality, form of knowledge, and form of expression. So just to wrap it up on this slide, the fragment provides an entry point to understanding cities in the urban world, but I think is easily overlooked. Of course, there's lots of great research on fragments out there of different kinds, but it's easy to overlook the importance of fragments because we tend to look elsewhere for the things that really matter about cities. We tend to look for policy and law and economic processes, and all of those matter enormously. But what I'm saying is that fragments too can provide a really important entry point to understanding the city, and to do so in different ways. I've just explained briefly 3 different ways of doing that, but there are other ways of doing it, I'm sure. I'm interested, as I said at the start, in how fragments are made and remade as verbs, so as things that are pulled into changing relationships between people and cities, and how that changes over time. I'm interested in what that tells us about urban experience and urban politics. Very often, as you saw in Cape Town and Kampala, these fragments are sites of struggle, right? They're not kind of like they're places, they're relationships where people are struggling to cope, right? In contexts of great inequality, just to get the basics, just to provide the basics of urban life. Working with fragments of toilets or water infrastructure, working just to find ways of getting by and make a living and so on. So it's not, I wouldn't want to romanticize those at all, because they are sites of struggle. At the same time, they're also more than that. Fragments are also relationships, or get caught up in relationships, which can reveal new political questions of the city and the urban condition, and which also, as I've been hinting, can present new kinds of questions about the urban commons, right? New kinds of political experiments, such as the Cape Town poo protests, for example, or an exhibition, or whatever it might be, which open up new routes to thinking about the urban commons, or to imagining the urban commons. So finally, just 5 questions to end with, which have been on my mind, and I think which come out of the book, but which maybe are also on your mind, is, what might the use of fragments in the city teach us about the experience of urban life? So if we're interested in how people experience cities, and I think most people interested in cities are interested in that question, then what's the role of fragments compared to other ways of understanding the urban experience? What might how people use fragments reveal about cities and how people experience them? Secondly, how might fragments disrupt the urban political, right? And I gave some examples of that from Cape Town, but how might they provide clues to different kinds of conditions, to different kinds of cities? And I touched on that a little bit in the Kampala exhibition. How might fragments help us think about the remaking and the reimagining of the urban commons, right? So if the urban commons is the distribution of resources and provisions and opportunities, then how might fragments, as relationships which can politicize the city and ask questions of the city, how might they help us to foster and build a different kind of urban commons? Thirdly, how might fragments be conceptualized in different contexts? So I've not spent a lot of time on that, but we might think about fragments as things, fragments as knowledge, fragments as forms of writing. How might we understand fragments in those very different contexts, and how might we connect them? Fourthly, how might fragments be researched? So what kind of methods? So I've talked about walking, I talked about exhibitions, interviews, but there's also ethnography, film, participatory techniques. What kinds of methods might be used to kind of locate and understand and follow the fragment city? And then finally, what might the fragment offer ways of theorizing and conceptualizing cities and the urban world more generally? So how important might fragments be for how we theorize cities more generally? So that's it. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to any questions or discussion that you might have. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Colin McFarlane, for the wonderful lecture. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are watching us. A special greeting to our students at FAUSP. We have organized this series of lectures to reflect on the commons from a perspective directed to urban themes. And we've invited specialized researchers to discuss the urban commons in the realm of urban theory, urban design, and urban goals. We are very pleased to start our conversation today with Professor Colin McFarlane, who is a researcher of such a great importance in the field of urban theory, and who is a professor of both departments of geography, political state space, and urban worlds at Durham University in the UK. Before opening this discussion, I will make some quick remarks. We are opening our Q&A session, so please feel free to already formulate your questions and post them on the YouTube chat. You can post your questions in both Portuguese and English, and the Portuguese question will be translated. While people are warming up, I already have some questions. I would really like to hear from Professor McFarlane a little bit more on his understanding, his own understanding on the urban commons, and how does his own definition of urban commons intertwine with the notion of urban fragment, which you already tackled in your lecture. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So I think of the urban commons principally, as I was trying to allude to in the talk, really in relation to the distribution of resources. So I think sometimes urban commons gets defined in relation to public space or public goods. And I think the urban commons is more than that, isn't it? The urban commons is this shared realm of resources, provisions, but also opportunities, the social, economic, political opportunities and rights in the city. So it's much more than just access to public space, for example. It's much more than just access to a particular infrastructure or form of housing. It's a name for the larger distribution of possibilities in the city, whether it's material provisions or whether it's social, cultural, political, economic opportunities and rights. So I think of the commons as a large kind of umbrella term for thinking about that project. Of course, it has a very particular history connected to certain types of debates, which we could go into. But I think that what I find useful about it is precisely its flexibility and versatility. I think the last thing I would say about that is that the consequence of that definition of the commons, that expansive definition of the commons, is also to position, it has implications for politics, right? Because my argument, as you might have kind of guessed from my talk, is not that there is any particular form of politics that is appropriate to realizing the urban commons. So if you're interested in the redistribution of basic provisions, if you're interested in the redistribution of rights, if that's part of a struggle for the commons, then my argument is not that there is a particular political strategy that we should be adopting. Instead, the way I see the politics of the commons is much more open and experimental. So I go into this in some discussion in the book, but there are there's a long history in urban debate of kind of judging this form of politics as more useful or important than that form of politics. My argument is that this is really about context, right? So the political strategy that works to help us realize the urban commons is very much about the context, the situation, the place, the history that you find the struggle in, right? And so, what's more productive than kind of trying to judge this political strategy as useful or that political strategy as not useful, is to learn what different kinds of politics might open up in different kinds of times, in different kinds of places. So one example there would be Gibson Graham's post-politics arguments. I think those writings really powerfully capture the possibility of experimentalism as a way of thinking about the politics of generating the urban commons. So the fragment really is a product of the inequalities of distribution that underpin the urban commons as we find it in cities today, that's produced these fragments of infrastructure and knowledge and so on. But it's also a way of destabilizing, disrupting, challenging, and contesting that distribution, right? The urban commons, and reimagining a different kind of urban commons. So that's what I was trying to kind of get at in that relationship between the fragment and the commons. Does that answer the question, Anna, or not?
That answered the question quickly. We have already some questions on the YouTube chat. I will read the comments from our students. We have a long question from Daniela Malaya, our student. She says, Colin, thank you so much for your exposition. I think it's renovating to think and about cities from the point of view of fragments, these bits of stuff we leave behind to the city in our existence. But one thing that always gets me when I think about the commons is the contraposition between the local and punctual scale and the global and larger scale. This came to my mind, especially when you were talking about the knowledge fragments. It reminded me of the decolonial studies and how it disputes not a space in the hegemonic discourse, but the creation of new centers of our own to make our comprehension of the world not an exception. I would love to hear your input on this contraposition. Thank you once again.
Yeah. Well, it's a really excellent question, Daniela. Thanks very much for that. So in relation to the work in Kampala, the knowledge fragments that we described there, the exhibition, I mean, we were trying to do something quite modest, I think, and I think maybe I didn't communicate that enough in what I was saying, but exhibitions can only achieve so much, right? They're only parts of a story in a city, and people come into the exhibition and they leave the exhibition and they think about it for a little bit and they forget about it, or whatever. And the events we organized around it, I think we were quite realistic that it was not going to change radically the knowledge politics of the city, right? I guess my point was that it becomes part of a larger, more sustained struggle and politics of trying to bring forms of knowledge, ways of knowing the city which are excluded and marginalized, into the center of the city. And by the center, I mean not just the geographical center, but the political and discursive center. So, for example, Joel, one of the guys we worked with in the project, Joel Ongwick, wrote a piece for the local newspaper in Kampala about the exhibition, trying to make the point that these are people's lives which are usually stigmatized and marginalized and not part of the media debate, the political debate or the media debate in the city, and that they need to be heard in the newspapers and in the online debates and in the city much more. So there was a recognition that you've got a political ambition. The political ambition is to disrupt the knowledge politics of power in the city, where certain voices are excluded and stigmatized and not heard from. But the political project demands an experimentalism with different kinds of techniques over time, of which the exhibition is just one, right? So that's just firstly to say that I think we have to be, I think the contours of your question outline a vast political challenge about the politics of knowledge in cities. So that's just going from the local to the city. In terms of thinking about the global, and some of the decolonial debates, I mean, it's vastly important to try to think about this in relation to something like urban theory, right? Because urban theory, as we all know, has traditionally been based disproportionately on Anglo-American scholarship and debates. So, the kinds of work that I've been describing in places like Kampala or Cape Town or Mumbai, the kind of readership, the kind of reading and bringing in of voices from different parts of the urban worlds and foregrounding them as centers of knowledge production, not as peripheral to a kind of historical Anglo-American power, is, again, a much larger and project than the one I was talking about today, but is vital, is crucial, is something that I think we're all trying to kind of like work on in different ways. And I'd be interested to hear what you guys think of that from from Sao Paulo or thinking about this from Brazil. And just as a side point, I'm also I'm one of the editors at Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, and one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're trying to ask scholars in different parts of the world, including contributors from Brazil, to write short commentaries about how they understand geography as a subject, right, as a discipline, from their kind of institutional ground, right? So from Sao Paulo, or so we've got people from India, Brazil, South Africa, kind of all over the world. We've got about 15 people who are part of it so far, who are kind of trying to disrupt the idea that we know what geography as a subject is, right? Which has been inherited from a kind of Anglo-American structure of power knowledge, and to kind of tell a different kind of story, or not so different kind of story, depending on what the case is, from different parts of the world, in order to learn about what geography really is today, globally, right? What's actually going on in geography today. So this, as a geographer, this is fascinating for me, but I think that's one way, and again, it's a very small way, of trying to respond to some of the decolonial question about knowledge. That's not about fragments, but it's just what came to mind when I was thinking about some of the global decolonial challenges that you were pointing to. I'm happy to hear if you think, Daniela, that that's completely off the point. or if anyone else has anything else to say on that. I think it's a really important question. I've clearly fumbled my way through it, but great question.
Thank you for clarifying some decolonial in urban theory, urban theory, and also some need to produce knowledge in urban theory beyond parochialism. That was a very interesting point. I open the question to Professor Leandro. Professor Leandro, perhaps do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Well, thank you again, Professor Macfarlane. It was a very interesting and inspiring lecture. Well, the issues of fragmentation can be understood as a kind of opposition to the process of rationalizations that in some way guided the process of modernization in Europe and much part of the world in the last century, especially in terms of urbanism as a process or theory. And this process, we know now, serves the interests of the capitalists much more than those of society as a whole. In the sense, your talk created an interesting tension between the concept of Gilles Lefebvre, the concept of everyday life, and the concept of Rizal Mathieu and some concept of from Milton Santos about the geography, the distinction in geography between rich and poor, and how the geography of the city can increase or decrease this kind of relationship. My question is about the state. If you have some position about the position of the role of the state in this context of the neoliberalism crisis and the generalized fragmentation of the urban space, because it seems, at least in Brazil, that there is a very clear relationship between the state and the organization of the urban fabric, and as a lack of counterpart in the favelas or in some kind of urban more fragmented space. You can see like the opposite, the lack of the state, and at the same time, the lack of some kind of infrastructure. Well, and we are living in a very special moment that all this kind of theories around the neoliberalism aren't so clear, or it's what is really clear is that the neoliberalism lives a very severe crisis since the crisis of 2008 and now after the pandemic event. I don't know if I make myself clear, but it's about that.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Leandro, for that really important reflection. I think that so the state, I didn't talk about it very much in the talk, but in relation to fragmentation, as you're suggesting, the state is often part of the problem, and has facilitated the process of economic fragmentation that you see spatialized in cities all over the world. Sometimes the state does this deliberately, and sometimes it does it almost by accident, but nonetheless does it. At the same time, so for example, if you say to some of the residents in Mumbai, who we did research on in relation to sanitation, if you say to them, look, let's try and work with the local government in order to improve water or sanitation, or housing, people would often just be shocked, or they would just laugh at you, right? Like the idea that the state is the one that's bringing the bulldozers half the time. So the state becomes this kind of object of fear. At the same time, the state is always more than that. Even in Mumbai, where we see it often developing these kind of models of neoliberal urbanization, the state is often because the state in India is vast, right? It's huge, and it has multifaceted levels and departments. And what happens is that local places, local officials, local activists, local civil society groups, get to know particular people within the state. Maybe they're lower level officials, sometimes they're higher level officials. But it's working those relationships and finding the alliances that sometimes leads to improvements in relation to fragments like water or sanitation on the ground. And this is also true in Kampala. I mean, one of the things that some of the NGOs were saying in Kampala was, try not to think about the state, think about particular people and departments in the state who are open to listening to you, because there are people there who are on your side, and you need to find them, and then it's building a very slow relationship with them, and then trying to shift the debate at state level, and it can take years. And so that was quite interesting to me, the idea of disrupting the notion of the state and thinking about openings within the state structure. At the same time, COVID has created a crisis for local governments, because I think that COVID, in many parts of the world, the pandemic has shifted the political imaginary of what the state might do. So, the state now is seen as more important in its relationship to health, for example, sanitation, basic provisions, and there's more demands being put on the state in many parts of the world. At the same time, the state often has less money than it had before the pandemic. So even if it has a political will to fill that new role, or that intensified role, it might not have the capacity. And I know that from some of the work that I'm doing here in the UK, speaking to local state officials, that they feel a huge sense of responsibility coming out of the pandemic, but might not have the resource or political scope to do it. So I think, in other words, I think the state takes a very different role in different parts of the urban world. And I think the question of opening and closure and the state's responsibility is very contextual. So I would want to avoid caricaturing, or I wouldn't want to say a particular singular explanation of state logics as a way of understanding fragmentation. I think there are complexities and contextual factors which disrupt that quite radically, and which open up a political project of working with the states and trying to push the state discursively or politically at different moments. So that's kind of just responding to some of what you said. It's not really an answer, Leandro, but maybe it's a conversation we can continue another time. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It was a very clear
Thank you.
comment.
Thank you, Professor Colin McFarlane. It has been an honor to have you here today. I think also on behalf of WSP community, we are reaching the end of our time. So we are going to close our session. We can continue this conversation further on. And we wish you to see in other opportunities. Professor Leandro, do you want to make some final words for this closing session?
No, just thank you again, Professor Colin McFarlane. It was a pleasure for us, this lecture, and to meet you in this meeting.
Yeah,
it was a very nice conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for
our
the
next slide.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.